I left my broke boyfriend, who used me to build his dream, then tried to crawl back after his success. My boyfriend, Jake, and I had been together for 2 years. We met at a local coffee shop where he worked part-time while taking community college classes. I was working as a retail manager, pulling long hours but making decent money. Jake was always short on cash, living paycheck to paycheck, but he was charming, funny, and had big dreams. He'd talk about starting his own business, something tech-related, though he never had a clear plan. I paid for most of our dates, covered rent when he couldn't, and even helped with his car repairs once. It wasn't a big deal at first. I liked him, and I figured he'd get on his feet eventually. Jake started getting serious about his business ideas about a year into our relationship. He'd spend hours on his laptop, sketching out apps or researching startups, saying he wanted to build something that would change our lives. I supported him, listening to his plans and even helping him brainstorm names for his app. He had no tech background, just some coding classes, but his passion was contagious. He'd stay up late working, sometimes falling asleep at his desk. I admired his drive, but worried he was in over his head. He'd talk about investors and going big, but he was still broke, borrowing money from me for basic stuff like groceries. Things started to shift when Jake quit his coffee shop job to focus on his app full-time. He said he'd found a mentor online, some guy who'd sold a startup and was guiding him. I was skeptical. Jake barely had savings, and now he had no income. I was covering all our bills, and my savings were taking a hit. He promised it would pay off, saying he was close to finishing a prototype for an app that helped small businesses track inventory. I didn't understand the details, but he showed me a rough version and it looked promising. Still, I was frustrated. I'd come home from 10-hour shifts to find him glued to his laptop, dishes piled up, and no contribution to our expenses. I started feeling more like his mom than his girlfriend. One night, I found an email open on his laptop from his mentor, talking about a pitch to investors in a few months. The email mentioned Jake needing to prove commitment by investing his own money. I got worried. He didn't have any money to invest unless it was mine. When I asked him about it, he brushed it off, saying he'd figure it out. That's when I noticed he'd been using my credit card for small purchases, software subscriptions, a new laptop charger, without asking. It wasn't a lot, maybe $200, but it felt like a line had been crossed. I started checking my bank statements more closely and saw a few other charges I didn't recognize, like a $50 payment to a website for business tools. I didn't confront him right away. I wanted to believe he was just desperate to make his dream work, but the pressure was building. He was spending all his time on this app, skipping classes and leaning on me to keep us afloat. I started feeling trapped, like I was funding a gamble that might never pay off. I loved him, but I was tired of carrying the weight. I began keeping a log of the charges and his promises about the app, not sure what I'd do with it, but needing some control. I also talked to a friend who said I should set boundaries before I lost more money. I wasn't ready to break up, but I knew something had to change. I decided to wait until his investor pitch to see if his hard work would amount to anything, or if I'd have to make a tough call. As Jake's investor pitch got closer, the strain between us grew. I was still covering our rent, utilities, and most of our groceries, while he poured every waking hour into his app. He'd stopped going to his community college classes entirely, saying they were a distraction from his real work. His laptop was always open, filled with code I didn't understand and spreadsheets tracking his app's features. He'd show me updates sometimes, like a new inventory tracking tool he'd coded, and I could see he was making progress. But progress didn't pay the bills, and my retail job was barely keeping us above water. I'd started dipping into my emergency savings, which made me anxious. Jake's promises about the app kept me hopeful for a while. He said his mentor had connected him with 2 investors who were interested in his prototype. He needed to nail the pitch to get funding, which could mean a real paycheck and a chance to pay me back. But I noticed he was getting secretive. He'd close his laptop when I walked into the room, and his phone was always locked now. I found another unauthorized charge on my credit card, a $100 payment for a business consultation service. When I asked him about it, he said it was a one-time fee to polish his pitch deck and swore he'd pay me back after the pitch. I was angry but let it slide, not wanting to derail him days before his big moment. I started documenting more than just the charges. I saved screenshots of his emails when he left his laptop open, including one from his mentor urging him to secure personal funds to show investors he was serious. I also noted how often he was gone, meeting his mentor at coffee shops or working late at a co-working space he'd somehow gotten access to. One night, I checked our joint bank account and saw a $300 withdrawal I didn't know about. Jake said it was for app testing tools, but he couldn't show me receipts. My trust was eroding, and I felt like I was bankrolling a dream I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. The pitch was set for a Friday at a startup incubator downtown. Jake spent the week practicing, pacing our apartment in a borrowed suit, reciting his presentation. I helped him rehearse, timing his slides and giving feedback, even though I was frustrated. The day before the pitch, I found a receipt in his jacket pocket for a $150 dinner at a restaurant we'd never been to. He claimed it was a meeting with his mentor to prep, but I didn't buy it. I was done ignoring the red flags. I decided to attend the pitch unannounced to see if his app was as promising as he claimed. I also wanted to know if he'd mention my financial support or act like it was all his effort. The pitch event was in a sleek office space with about 20 people, investors, other entrepreneurs, and a few mentors. Jake didn't know I was there sitting in the back. He presented confidently, showing off his app's features and talking about its potential to help small businesses. He got applause and a few nods from the investors, but he never mentioned me or the money I'd put in. He made it sound like he'd bootstrapped everything himself, even claiming he'd sacrificed his own savings. I left before it ended, feeling betrayed. That night he came home excited, saying 2 investors wanted to meet again. I didn't bring up what I'd heard. I needed time to think. Over the next week, I weighed my options. Jake was riding high, planning follow-up meetings, but he still wasn't contributing to our bills. I found another $50 charge on my card for a networking event. I was exhausted, working overtime to cover us while he chased his dream. I talked to my sister, who said I deserved someone who valued my support, not just my money. I started looking at apartments I could afford alone. I wasn't ready to confront Jake yet, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I decided to wait until after his investor meetings to see if he'd get funding and if he'd finally acknowledge what I'd done for him. After Jake's pitch, I was at my breaking point. He'd presented his app like he'd done it all alone, ignoring the fact that I'd been paying our bills and covering his expenses for months. I'd found unauthorized charges on my credit card, $200 here, $50 there, for his business needs like software, dinners, and networking events. I had screenshots of his emails, receipts, and my bank statements showing how much I'd supported him. He was riding high after the pitch, talking about follow-up meetings with investors, but he still hadn't paid me back or even thanked me. I was done carrying him, and I knew I had to make a decision. I waited a week to see if his investor meetings would change anything. Jake came home one night, saying he'd secured a small seed round, $50,000 to develop his app further. He was ecstatic, planning to quit school and work on it full-time. I asked if he'd use some of the money to cover what he owed me, at least the $1,000 I'd tracked from my savings and card. He said the funds were tied up in development, and he'd pay me later. That was it for me. I'd been patient, hoping his success would mean we could move forward together, but he was still taking me for granted. I started packing my things that weekend, quietly looking for a new apartment I could afford on my retail salary. I didn't tell Jake I was leaving right away. I wanted to be sure I had a plan. I found a small studio nearby, put down a deposit, and moved my essentials over a few days while he was out meeting his mentor. I left most of our shared stuff behind. I didn't want to fight over dishes or furniture. Before I left, I wrote a letter explaining why I was done. I laid out how I'd supported him through his broke days, paid for everything, and even helped with his app, only for him to use my money without asking and take all the credit. I left the letter on the kitchen table with printouts of the bank statements and receipts showing what he'd taken. I moved out that Friday, blocking his number to avoid a messy confrontation. For the next few months, I focused on myself. I worked extra shifts to rebuild my savings, started hanging out with new coworkers, and even took a coding class to understand the tech world Jake was so obsessed with. I didn't hear from him, and I didn't check his social media. Life felt lighter without the constant stress of carrying someone else. 4 years later, I was in a better place. Promoted to assistant manager at my job, living in a nicer apartment, and dating someone new who respected me. Then I saw an article online about Jake's app. It had launched successfully, gotten major funding, and was now used by thousands of small businesses. He was being interviewed as a self-made entrepreneur, no mention of me or my support. I was curious and a little hurt, so I reached out. I sent him an email congratulating him but mentioning how I'd helped him get there. I wasn't subtle. I attached the same bank statements and receipts I'd left in the letter. I said I didn't want anything, just acknowledgement for what I'd done. He replied a week later saying he appreciated my support back then, but that his success was his own hard work. He offered to meet for coffee to catch up. I agreed, thinking maybe he'd changed. At the coffee shop, he was polite but dismissive, saying I'd overreacted by leaving and that the money I'd given him was part of being a couple. I showed him the evidence again, calmly pointing out the 1,000 plus he'd taken without asking. He got defensive, saying I was holding a grudge and that he didn't owe me anything. I walked away knowing I'd made the right choice leaving him. His success was real, but it didn't erase how he'd used me. I learned to set boundaries and not let someone's dreams drain my own life. I'm proud of where I am now, stable, independent, and with people who value me. Jake's app might be a hit, but I don't regret walking away when I did. It taught me to trust my worth and never let someone take credit for my sacrifices.